Hello, I'm Jan Newharth, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Forum. Welcome to First Five Now, a Freedom Forum conversation series that explores topical issues and features current newsmakers who are using the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment to guide their work. Today, we are pleased to present a conversation with Ian Rosenberg to talk about his new book, The Fight for Free Speech, 10 Cases That Define Our First Amendment Freedoms. The book is a user's guide to understanding contemporary free speech issues. It distills the spectrum of free speech law to 10 critical issues, with each chapter focusing on a current free speech question and explaining the key Supreme Court case that provides the answers. This program is brought to you by the Freedom Forum, which fosters First Amendment freedoms for all. Our vision is an America where everyone knows, understands, values, and defends the freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. And now, please welcome our moderator, John Maynard.
Well, thank you, Jan, and welcome to First Five Now. I'm John Maynard, Senior Director of Programs for the Freedom Forum. Today, it seems more than ever, Americans are confronted by a barrage of questions related to their free speech freedoms. Can a president of the United States be banned from social media? Does a book publisher have the right to pull out of a book deal with a U.S. senator? Can athletes take a knee without any repercussions? Today, we'll answer some of the more pressing questions about this often misunderstood First Amendment right by looking at where free speech protections originated and how they might develop in the future. We are joined by Ian Rosenberg, author of The Fight for Free Speech, 10 Cases That Define Our First Amendment Freedoms. The book focuses on contemporary free speech questions, from student walkouts for gun safety to Samantha Bee's on-air expletives, from Nazis marching in Charlottesville to the muting of adult film star Stormy Daniels, and identifies, unpacks, and explains the key Supreme Court case that provides the answers. Ian has over 20 years of experience as a media lawyer and has worked as a legal counsel for ABC News since 2003. He began his legal career clerking in the Eastern District of New York. He is also an Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker and teaches media law at Brooklyn College. Ian, welcome to First Five Now.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Let's start with just how you came up with the idea for this book, which, it really is a user-friendly guide to some of the key free speech cases in our history.
Oh, yeah. So the beginning, the origin for me was when I was talking with my kids at the dinner table after vetting a report for my job as a media lawyer about the student activists who were responding to the tragedy at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, the school shooting. And my kids, who were then ages 10 and 12, wanted to know, if they participated in the National School Walkout, what would happen to them? Would they be punished? What were their rights and what were their fellow students' rights? And in explaining to them, I realized that we could talk about important First Amendment concepts, and you can speak about them in clear and simple language. Wisdom can be condensed, but it doesn't have to be dumbed down. And that's really one of the guiding principles of my book, is that we can talk about our free speech rights in a way that's accessible, I think very entertaining, but also is clear. And so in my career, I've been working with smart people who are not lawyers, journalists, producers, students at Brooklyn College. And I've learned from those conversations and the conversations with my kids how to tell these stories, I think, in a new way.
Yeah, as I mentioned in my opening, there does seem to be some confusion, especially lately, about what freedom of speech really is and what it protects. Tell us your assessment on people's knowledge about this basic First Amendment right.
Well, I think, it's a truly American value, and Americans really know about the concept of their right to free speech. And people clamor for their right to speak and to be heard, and will happily trot out the phrase, I have a right to free speech. But what I think is the difficulty is that people don't really have any place to turn to go deeper than that. They don't understand, because they haven't been exposed to clear guidance about the rights and limits of our free speech. And they don't know the stories behind the people who fought for those rights. So when I began teaching about 5 years ago, I found that for non-law school classes, there is really very few guides, very few books written in the last 10 years that address free speech law for non-lawyers. And that is therefore understandable that Americans really don't fully understand the rights and limits of their speech protections.
Right. So for the book, you choose 10 contemporary issues, 10 chapters. They're all within about the past decade, and connected them to Supreme Court cases that went back even a century ago. First of all, tell us how you chose some of these contemporary issues that you discuss in the book.
Well, as you mentioned, we talk about Take a Knee, the controversy surrounding Colin Kaepernick. We talk about National School Walkout. We talk about Nazis marching in Charlottesville, and Samantha Bee's expletives. The easy part was finding contemporary questions that people have about free speech. A bit of the challenge was then finding 10 Supreme Court cases that very clearly answer the questions raised by those controversies. And so I present the Supreme Court cases chronologically throughout the book, so that hopefully, like a great record album, they build over time, with each one sort of informing the next one, although you can dip in and just read the particular controversy or case that you're interested in. So we do begin in 1919 with the Abrams case, immigrant anarchists sending out anti-World War I leaflets, throwing them from Lower East Side rooftops. And we end in 2017 with a case about our current social media speech rights, the Supreme Court's only significant discussion of our social media rights. So it's a combination of the questions that everyone has today with actual clear and concrete answers based on Supreme Court precedent.
Right. Well, let's start. And we won't have time to delve into all 10 stories, and we'll leave it to those watching to buy the book and read the book. But let's discuss some of the cases. And you do start the book with the protests from the Women's March to Black Lives Matter. And you do link it back to this monumental free speech case in 1919. So why don't we talk a little bit about that case?
Sure. So the Abrams case, and I like to focus on Molly Steimer, who came to this country as a Jewish immigrant at 16, fleeing the pogroms in Eastern Europe. And she became radicalized by her very hard life on the Lower East Side, and became an anarchist, and with her fellow anarchists put out these pamphlets that were attacking America's involvement in World War I, particularly the then recent incursions into Russia, and she believed an effort to thwart the Russian Revolution. So they threw these pamphlets out the window that did advocate what was then illegal action. They were saying that to oppose the draft and to stop munitions. And they were convicted and put in jail. And this is one case where the Supreme Court decision didn't vindicate their rights. In fact, the majority found that it was okay to criticize, to be imprisoned for criticizing the government. But Justice Holmes, joined by Justice Brandeis, had a landmark dissent. And he introduced the concept of the marketplace of ideas in that case, which really changed entirely our notion of free speech law in this country, which embraced the idea that criticism of the government was necessary and a part of the push and pull of the discussion in our community, in the veritable marketplace of ideas that we experience every day. What I didn't know when I was writing the book, and until now that it's being published, was that the discussion that led out of the Abrams case about incitement would be so contemporary and relevant. You are able to advocate for illegal action, but only up until that point in which you intend to cause imminent legal harm or imminent violence, and it's directed to that. So we have that very issue plaguing us in terms of the impeachment claims against President Trump. So it's just another example of how our history really informs our very contemporary present.
Do you think that case will come up in the Senate impeachment trial?
Well, I don't think the case will come up in the trial because the First Amendment is actually a bit of a red herring in terms of whether that applies to the impeachment context. There is no First Amendment bar on impeachment or any of the grounds for impeachment. But President Trump's lawyers have already raised a quasi First Amendment defense, and they're not paying enough attention to Abrams and the case that comes out of Abrams, Brandenburg, which creates the incitement test. And taking it even a step further back, I think it's important that everyone remember that the First Amendment in no way protects violence. The First Amendment in no way protects trespass, even if that's violence or trespass is happening in conjunction with what would otherwise be a valid and protected protest. There are definite limits to the First Amendment, and those are two clear-cut examples.
Right. With the Super Bowl fresh in our mind, it seems appropriate to discuss another chapter in your book, and that's involving Colin Kaepernick, famously taking the knee. Now, the efforts of the NFL to prohibit players from protesting does provide an opportunity to explain the limits of the First Amendment, right, when it comes to private companies and employee speech. But you write that the analysis shouldn't stop there. Tell us why.
Well, that's right. So first, we do need to remember a threshold question that the First Amendment applies to Congress. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, and that has now been interpreted to mean the federal government, the states, and any sort of quasi-governmental actors. It does not apply to private companies. So the NFL is allowed to restrict the speech rights of its employees. However, exactly as you point out, as I say in my book, I don't think the conversation should end there for two reasons. One, because we are also talking about our free speech values and what is important to us as a society, but also equally important, if you are a student athlete and you are taking a knee or protesting in some way at a public university or a public high school, the key case absolutely protects your right not to speak. And the case I talk about is Barnett, in which two elementary school sisters who were Jehovah's Witnesses chose to no longer pledge allegiance to the flag during World War II, and they said it was a form of idolatry and violated their religious principles, and that went up all the way to the Supreme Court and vindicated their right not to speak, and more specifically, the right to not have the government compel you to speak a message that you don't agree with. So I talk about how the Barnett sisters stand squarely behind Colin Kaepernick and his right to choose to express his message as against racial injustice, as he did, and as others joined him in doing so. And I think what's also interesting is how much our perception of that event, particularly white people's perceptions of those protests, have changed now that we have the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd.
Right. Moving on to another chapter, I never thought there was a connection between the Pentagon Papers and adult film star Stormy Daniels, but there is. Why don't you talk a little bit about the parallels of the Pentagon Papers, which is a very well-known case, but perhaps a little primer would be great, and the connection to Stormy Daniels and her appearance on 60 Minutes.
Yeah. So, well, when Stormy Daniels, the adult film star who had the alleged affair with Trump, her lawyer tweeted out that she was going to appear with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes. The media first went crazy about like what's she going to say, and then the question became, will she be able to say it? The president of CBS News had to, at part of a press conference, had to say that there was absolutely no way that that interview was going to be stopped from going forward. And the reason that he felt so confident, and the reason that she could feel confident in speaking out, despite the fact that she had some complicated NDA, non-disclosure agreement issues with Trump, was because of the Pentagon Papers case. And the Pentagon Papers case, for those who don't know, I tell the story, I think, in a new way, really focusing on how at the time it was not a fait accompli. We really didn't know that Daniel Ellsberg, who was leaking, had leaked to the New York Times and later other newspapers, national security information about the Vietnam War during wartime. We did not know that, and then the Nixon administration literally got an order from a district court in New York to stop the presses and to stop publication. We did not know that was going to turn out to be the ultimate free press victory that it was. And I talk about how really the whole case turns on one question at oral argument. And sometimes people say, oh, oral argument doesn't really matter, but I think this was an example where it really did. It was really a nail biter of a decision. But when the Supreme Court says that prior restraints, meaning advanced restrictions on speech, prohibiting the press from speaking, are presumptively unconstitutional, meaning unconstitutional in almost all circumstances, including even national security documents during wartime, which had been labeled top secret, the highest level of security clearance. If that can't be stopped by the government, by the President of the United States and his lawyers themselves, we can have some confidence that Stormy Daniels will be able to speak. Now, when I wrote the book, that was before there were rumors that Trump had thought about trying to stop her from speaking, and that's what the media had been responded to. Of course, since then, and I refer to this briefly in the book, we have Trump and his surrogates did attempt to bring prior restraints against John Bolton's book, and his family tried to stop Mary Trump's book, and both of those cases were dismissed, and the restrictions were not allowed. But the answer to why they were not allowed really goes back to the Pentagon Papers, which I explain in detail in the book.
Right. I was hoping you could follow up on when we started this conversation about that dinner conversation with your kids about the student walkouts, and that's also addressed in your book. Talk a little about how you address that in the book and the Supreme Court case you reference with the student walkout, which happened a year after the horrible shootings in Florida.
Right. So we have these national student walkouts. I mean, this movement among young people to leave class and to protest the inaction on gun control and gun safety. And that is the contemporary question of what are your student speech rights? And the answer to that question is a fantastic example of students making an enormous difference in our First Amendment law and in our free speech rights. Mary Beth Tinker, who's the defendant who, the plaintiff who I focus on in my book, she was in middle school and she decided that she was going to wear a black armband to protest the Vietnam War that was going on, and to honor both sides of death and the conflict, and saying that you were honoring Vietnamese death at the time was a very controversial statement. So she wore her armband to school. She was sent home. They were going to suspend her, and her brother and a friend ultimately did it as well. And their case leads to, and they're in Iowa, in small town Iowa, where at the time the war was still fairly popular and people supported it. But by the time their case reached the Supreme Court, the country was basically evenly divided over support for the war. And their actions to wear an armband had started to seem much less radical compared to some of the other violence that was sweeping college campuses at the time. But memorably, the court said that students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gates. And that's a beautiful phrase that really conveys that just some unsubstantiated fear of disruption is not enough for students to have their speech rights restricted. However, I do then want to answer the question of, can you walk out of school? And unfortunately, Tinker, or perhaps fortunately, Tinker does not protect the right to leave class. That is a substantial disruption. But But it does reaffirm the principle that you can't be punished more for leaving class to protest a cause that may be unpopular in your community than you could just to skip class because you want to go to the mall. So there was a lot of news reports at the time that it seemed like principals were taking a vindictive stand against protesters, particularly in communities where gun control laws were unpopular. So Tinker still is the key case for understanding all of student speech.
Right. Ian, you end the book analyzing the problems of social media and what First Amendment protection should be afforded to online speech. Obviously a huge issue. And you write about, and I hadn't heard of this, a 2017 Supreme Court ruling that found a state law prohibiting a sex offender from accessing social media unconstitutional. Expand on this case a bit more and why you chose to focus on this case.
Well, Packingham is the Supreme Court's first and only significant discussion of social media law. It came in 2017, as you said, and that shows a little bit about how behind the court is in responding to sort of developing trends in social media law or in sort of speech law on new frontiers. But Justice Kennedy wrote the decision, one of his last significant free speech decisions before leaving the bench. And what he says is that social media today is like the vast democratic forms of the internet. It's a public park on steroids. We have this tradition that you can speak out in public parks, you can speak on public sidewalks, that's where you sort of have a core First Amendment right to protest. And he's saying that social media is vital to individuals' ability to speak out today. So sort of a sweeping law in North Carolina that banned all sex offenders from any access whatsoever to social media was too broadly infringing on our right to speak, and more specifically, too broadly restricting what he viewed as a core component of contemporary speech, the social media itself. So unfortunately, this is one case, perhaps because it's so contemporary and perhaps because social media problems are so vast and complicated, where we don't have a clear answer. This Supreme Court case, unlike the other 10 cases in my book, doesn't give you an exact answer. It just tells you what goes too far. And it indicates that both the more liberal wing and the conservative wing of the court, although it's changing, are still very unlikely to find government restrictions on social media to be constitutionally valid. That doesn't mean, once again, this is not where the conversation should end. There's a lot of areas in which social media needs to reform itself, and we should all press for those reforms if that's your belief. But the First Amendment isn't the tool with which to do it, or certainly not a tool that the court is going to support.
Can I ask you what you think the biggest problems are about social media speech today and how these problems can be best addressed?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, I do think that that incitement to violence we have seen and hate speech online is the most disturbing and most significant problem we have in our speech rights. And this is something that I fully support personally social media companies seeking to address. They are constitutionally allowed as private actors to restrict and even deplatform the President of the United States, and to do that with other people who they believe whose speech is leading to violence or vital misinformation or providing misinformation about vital issues, and I support that. Now, social media companies should be more transparent about their policies, and there's a lot of other areas for reform. But social media speech and online speech is definitely the future of free speech, and how we advocate about that future is something that we can definitely draw on our past to inform how we go forward.
It's remarkable that you said that this 2017 case, that was the first time social media has been brought up in a Supreme Court case. Did I hear that correctly? Is that...
It's the first time they addressed it significantly. It was parts of other decisions, but they never focused on it beyond dicta, beyond sort of side references. Yes.
Certainly, you think it'll come up again in some cases going forward, I would imagine.
I think it's the future, and I think that we will see how they seek to address it. I believe that this court, if I have to prognosticate for a minute, I believe that this court is going to be actually quite reluctant to address those issues, and are going to take a step back as procedurally as long as they can, which means all the more reason that we need to address these issues ourselves. And one of the things I say in my book toward the end is that I use Supreme Court cases because they're the clearest way to distill what the free speech law and free press laws are today. And they answer many of the questions we have quite concretely, and I think that's very satisfying. However, free speech happens all the time, far away from the Supreme Court. It happens in our schools, it happens in classrooms, it happens in our mosques, and our synagogues and our churches, at community board meetings. And the goal of the fight for free speech is that people will start to embrace protecting their free speech rights or advocating for change with their free speech rights as a grassroots activity, and that this book will arm them with the knowledge they need to go forward.
Yeah, I was, and you said that so beautifully. At the end of the book, you write that we can make a difference in shaping public opinion on free speech. What are some other ways we can do that? You mentioned just grassroots efforts. What are some other ways that you can think of?
Well, I also, I think one of the, as President Biden has said, our democracy is fragile. And one of the ways in which we need to help shore up our democracy, I believe, is to defend the press. We've just been through 4 years of an administration that called the press the enemy of the people. And I work for the mainstream media, so I'm not objective, but I can also say that from personal experience, that nothing is further from the truth. That defending the press is vital to our democracy, that misrepresentations that the press can somehow lie and get away with it are completely untrue and do not reflect our First Amendment law. And I talk about the origins of libel law that come out of the civil rights movement. And I explain what the misunderstood actual malice test really means, but in the book in some detail, and why the civil rights leaders are really the heroes of our current libel law. But in short, it means that the press cannot intentionally lie, and they cannot turn a blind eye to the truth. If they do so, they will be found liable and responsible for significant damages, and that's a good balance. Brennan, when he wrote the decision, didn't want to give the media carte blanche or sort of blanket immunity, because he feared then the more recent days of McCarthyism, when people lied with impunity and got away with it. So getting back to your question, I do believe that another grassroots activity is that we should be more in support of the press, and that I think that this book will explain why the press really does the best job by following the law and being responsible actors that shore up our democracy.
And finally, Ian, tell us bottom line. What do you hope? Who do you hope reads this book, and what do you hope they get out of it? When they put this, they read these 10 incredible chapters. What do you hope they get out of it?
Well, this book is written for non-lawyers. There's no perfect word to say that, but I'm a lawyer, and this book is written for smart people who want to understand their free speech rights and their free press rights and the rights in their community, and people who want to engage in a dialogue about their free speech rights. And do so by hearing the stories of people who fought for them in the past. In law school, we often just hear what the rule is, what the case is, but we very little refer to the actual participants in those struggles. And the 10 pioneers, they're not all heroes. Some of them are not wonderful people. But the 10 pioneers that I discuss in this book are people who fought all the way to the Supreme Court for their right to speak and be heard. And I find their struggles inspiring, and I think they should inform all of our decisions going forward about how we advocate for our speech rights. So I hope that this short book will be a way that people can have a guide to their rights and then be able to speak about those rights with confidence.
The book is The Fight for Free Speech, 10 Cases That Define Our First Amendment Freedoms. For more information, visit www.thefightforfreespeech.com. Ian Rosenberg, thank you for joining us today on First Five Now.
Thanks, John. It's great to be on the show, and I really admire your organization.
Thank you. And we hope for those watching that you can join us for our next First Five Now on Thursday, February 18th at 2 o'clock when we discuss the new film, The Reunited States, which follows 4 everyday heroes on the difficult journey of bridging our political divides. And for more information about all our programming and initiatives, visit us at www.freedomforum.org. Thank you again for joining us for today's First Five Now.